Thomas was a man carved from the same rough stone that littered his property. At 45, his hands were maps of scars and calluses, a testament to a life spent fighting the earth for survival. He lived in a place the locals called Dead Man's Hollow, a deep, sunless depression at the base of the Iron Mountains where the fog clung to the ground until noon and the mud never truly dried. His house wasn't a home in the traditional sense. It was a fortress of survival, a chaotic assemblage of dark, weathered logs, patches of tin and mud mortar that seemed to be slowly sinking into the swampy earth. To the people in the nearest town, Thomas was a ghost, a wild thing that came down only to trade pelts for flour and nails. But inside the chest of the wild man beat a heart that was slowly dying of a terrible, consuming silence. The loneliness wasn't sharp anymore. It was a dull, heavy ache that sat on his chest every night as he ate his stew by the dim light of a smoky kerosene lantern. He had built a life, yes. He had land. He had cattle that survived the harsh winters. But he had no one to witness it. One rainy Tuesday, driven by a desperation that outweighed his pride, Thomas did the unthinkable. He walked into the town's general store, ignored the whispers and the stares of the townsfolk who moved away from his muddy boots, and bought a sheet of paper, an envelope, and a stamp. He stood at the counter, the pen feeling like a foreign object in his massive hand, and wrote an advertisement for the matrimonial section of the city newspaper. He didn't lie. He didn't promise gold or silk. He wrote, "Man of the mountains, hard worker, owns land. Seeks a wife of strong spirit to build a life. I offer a roof, food, and loyalty. The life is hard, but the heart is true." Sending that letter felt like throwing a bottle into a raging ocean. When he walked back to his hollow that evening, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty, it was filled with a terrifying, fragile hope. He cleaned his cabin for the first time in years. He scrubbed the soot from the windows, swept the dirt floor until the dust choked him, and even tried to fix the sagging porch that made the house look like a gaping mouth. He waited. Weeks turned into months. He checked the post office every time he went to town, enduring the smirk of the postmaster. Just when he was about to give up, to accept that he was destined to die alone in the dark, a reply came. And then another. Hope, it seemed, was a cruel thing. The first woman to answer the ad was a widow named Alara from the industrial city. She arrived in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming, masking the harshness of the hollow. Thomas had put on his only clean shirt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He met her at the train station with his wagon, freshly washed. The ride up to the mountains was pleasant enough. She spoke of wanting a quiet life, of being tired of the city's noise. But as the wagon crested the final hill and looked down into Dead Man's Hollow, the atmosphere shifted. The sun seemed to disappear behind the mountain's shadow. The road turned into a muddy track. And then she saw the house. It sat there like a dark bruise on the landscape, surrounded by dark pines and the swamp's mist. Alara didn't even wait for the wagon to stop completely. Her face, which had been smiling, twisted into a mask of pure horror and disgust. "You live there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "That isn't a house. That's a grave." Thomas tried to explain, tried to tell her that the timber was solid, that the fire was warm, that he would build a new room come summer. But she wouldn't listen. She demanded to be taken back to the station immediately, sobbing as if he had tried to murder her. The rejection cut deeper than any knife. He drove her back in silence, the shame burning his neck. 2 months later, another woman came. Sarah. She was younger, seemingly tougher. She made it as far as the porch. She stepped onto the creaking wood, looked at the mud tracked everywhere, smelled the scent of curing animal hides and damp wool that permeated the logs, and shook her head. "I expected poor," she said coldly, looking Thomas up and down as if he were livestock. "I didn't expect savage. A woman cannot live here, Thomas. Only beasts live here." She left the same afternoon. By the time the third woman arrived and fled upon seeing the rough outdoor latrine and the lack of running water, Thomas had changed. The hope in his chest had calcified into a hard, bitter rock. He stopped cleaning the windows. He stopped shaving. He threw the remaining letters into the fire, watching the paper curl and burn, deciding that the townspeople were right. He was a beast in a cave. He was meant to be alone. He vowed never to ask for anything again. Winter was approaching, the wind already carrying the scent of snow, when the postmaster handed him one last letter. It had been sitting there for weeks. Thomas almost threw it away, but something about the handwriting, sharp, angular, determined, made him open it. It was brief. My name is Beatrice. I am 30 years old. I have no family, no money, and no home. I am not afraid of work, and I am not afraid of the dark. If the offer still stands, I will come. I do not need a ticket. I will work my way there. There was no flowery language, no request for photos. Just a statement of fact. Thomas didn't reply, thinking she wouldn't come anyway. But 3 weeks later, on a gray, freezing afternoon, he found her standing at the edge of his property. Beatrice didn't look like the others. She was thin, her coat was threadbare and patched in a dozen places, and she carried all her worldly possessions in a single battered carpet bag. She wasn't beautiful in the delicate way Alara had been. Her face was sharp, her eyes were the color of steel, and her hands were red from the cold, missing gloves. She had walked the 5 miles from the station because no one would give her a ride to the Crazy Man's Hollow. Thomas stood on his porch, an axe in his hand, looking down at her. He didn't smile. He didn't welcome her. You see the house, he growled, his voice rusty from disuse. It's ugly. It's cold. The roof leaks when the snow melts. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away. Turn around. You can still make the evening train. Beatrice didn't flinch. She looked at the sagging porch, the mud, the dark forest looming behind the cabin. She looked at Thomas with his wild beard and dirty clothes. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who was afraid. She took a step forward, her boots sinking into the mud, and didn't look down. I've slept in doorways that smelled worse than this mud, Thomas, she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the wind. I've been cold in crowded rooms. This is just wood and dirt. Wood can be mended. Dirt can be swept. But a door that opens? That's rare. She walked right past him, up the creaking stairs, and stopped at the door. Are you going to let me in, or are we going to freeze out here discussing architecture? For the first time in years, Thomas was speechless. He opened the door. The first night was an exercise in awkward, silent tension. The interior of the cabin was worse than the outside suggested. It was a bachelor's den of neglect. Piles of unwashed tools, layers of soot on the walls, a bed made of rough furs in the corner. Beatrice didn't complain. She didn't say a word about the squalor. She simply set her bag down on a clean patch of floor, took off her coat, and rolled up the sleeves of her dress. Show me where the water is, she commanded. Thomas pointed to the bucket by the door. She nodded, found a rag, and started to scrub the table. She scrubbed with a ferocity that suggested she was trying to erase not just the dirt, but her own past. Thomas watched her from the fireplace, bewildered. Why? He finally asked, handing her a bowl of venison stew. Why stay? You saw the others. They ran. Beatrice stopped scrubbing, looking at the dark, soot-stained log wall. The others had somewhere to run to, she said softly. I don't. And besides. She looked at him, her eyes softening for the first time. They looked at the house and saw what it was. I look at it and see what it could be. It has strong bones, Thomas. Just like you. It's just forgotten. That winter was the hardest the Hollow had seen in decades. Snow buried the cabin up to the windowsills. But for the first time the cabin was warm. Not just from the fire, but from the presence of another human soul. Beatrice worked harder than any man Thomas had ever known. She didn't try to change him, but she changed the world around him. She sewed curtains from old flour sacks to keep the draft out. She organized his tools. She cooked meals that actually had flavor, using dried herbs she found in the root cellar. And slowly the silence in the house changed. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness anymore. It was the companionable silence of two people working towards a common goal. One evening, as the wind howled outside like a banshee, Thomas picked up his guitar, an instrument he hadn't touched in 10 years, and played a clumsy, stumbling tune. Beatrice stopped her mending, looked at him, and smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but in that dark cabin, it shone brighter than the sun. Thomas realized then that he wasn't guarding a fortress anymore. He was building a home. Spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent bursting of life. And with the spring came the true test. Beatrice had an idea. "The mud," she said one morning, looking out at the swampy ground that everyone hated. "It's rich, Thomas. It's black and deep. The reason nothing grows here is the water. If we dig trenches, if we drain the lower field, we could plant." The neighbors in town laughed when they heard Thomas was buying seeds for vegetables instead of just hay. "The crazy man and his stray cat are going to farm the swamp," they joked in the tavern. "Let them drown in the mud." But they didn't see what happened in the hollow. They didn't see Thomas and Beatrice waking up before dawn, digging drainage ditches by hand until their backs screamed in agony. They didn't see Thomas carrying stones to build a proper garden wall while Beatrice planted delicate seedlings with the tenderness of a mother. They worked until they were exhausted, collapsing into bed together, their hands seeking each other in the dark, finding comfort and strength in their shared struggle. The shared labor forged a bond stronger than any romantic poetry. They were comrades in a war against the elements. And then the miracle happened. The drainage worked. The black, ugly mud that everyone despised turned out to be the most fertile soil in the entire county. The vegetables that burst forth were monstrous in size and bursting with flavor. Pumpkins as big as carriage wheels, tomatoes red as blood, corn that stood tall and defiant against the wind. The house changed too. Thomas, inspired by Beatrice's faith in him, spent his evenings milling new lumber. He replaced the rotting logs. He built a wide, sturdy porch where they could sit in the evenings. He planted flower boxes for her. The dark, bruising shack of Dead Man's Hollow was gone. In its place stood a sturdy, proud log cabin, surrounded by a sea of green and gold, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a signal fire of victory. 5 years later, a carriage pulled up to the gate of the hollow. It wasn't a lost traveler, but the town banker and his wife, who happened to be Alara, the first woman who had fled in horror years ago. They had heard rumors of the miracle farm in the mountains that was supplying the best produce to the city markets, and they had come to see if they could buy the land. They expected to find Thomas still living in squalor, perhaps with a hag of a wife. What they found stopped them cold. The road was paved with crushed stone. The fences were white and straight. The house was beautiful, covered in climbing roses, with a new barn standing proudly to the side. And there on the porch sat Thomas and Beatrice. Thomas was clean-shaven, wearing a good suit, looking 10 years younger. Beatrice sat beside him, radiating a quiet, powerful dignity, holding a baby in her arms. Alara stepped down, her shoes crunching on the gravel, looking at the paradise that had been built from the mud she had scorned. "Thomas?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Is this the same place?" Thomas stood up, his arm going around Beatrice's waist. He looked at the woman who had called his home a grave, and then he looked at the woman who had turned it into a garden. "It's the same land, Alara," Thomas said gently. "But a house is only as good as the love inside it. You saw mud and ran. She saw soil and stayed. That's the difference." The banker offered a small fortune for the farm, but Thomas didn't even look at the check. He looked at Beatrice, who was smiling that same smile that had lit up the dark winter nights. "Not for sale," Thomas said. "We built this. We stay." As the carriage drove away, leaving a cloud of dust behind, Thomas and Beatrice sat back down, watching the sun set over their valley. The silence of Dead Man's Hollow was gone forever, replaced by the laughter of a child and the whisper of the wind through the corn, singing the song of the woman who stayed.